So guys, just recently I made a video on Insurgency 2014, and well, a ton of you guys were asking me in the comments of that one how it compares to Sandstorm. And well, that got me thinking, why does Insurgency still have a bunch of active players? Why haven't they made the switch yet? Well guys, this is BillyEatWorld again, and let's find out. Alright guys, welcome to the video, and just before we kick off, you might remember in the last Sandstorm video, I actually said I'd be giving away a few codes in this one. And well, I'm happy to say that the winners of that giveaway were Ismet92 and Kai Ra, so congrats on that guys, and keep an eye on your DMs because I'll be reaching out very soon. Now, in this video, I've actually got one more Sandstorm code to give away. So as usual, I'll be posting a link to that video's Twitter post in the description down below. And all you have to do is follow me and retweet that post to have a chance to win. And as usual, I'll be drawing the winner in the next Sandstorm video. Now, with that out of the way, to kick off, if you're not already familiar with this franchise, well, basically it started way back in 2007 as a source mod called Insurgency Modern Infantry Combat. And in a nutshell, it was an attempt by its creators, Jeremy Bloom and Andrew Spearin, to develop a more realistic military shooter based on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, at the time, modern military shooters weren't a new thing. For example, franchises like Counter-Strike and Battlefields were already pretty well established. But what made Insurgency unique was its gameplay style. It was still fast-paced like CS, but it was grittier, and above all, it was immersive. Now, it's safe to say back then Insurgency mod did have a cult following, but after a few years, its popularity had started to drop off and most of the original dev team had moved on to other things. And it wasn't until 2014 that we finally got a fully fledged standalone Insurgency game, which we now know as Insurgency 2014. Once again, it followed the original format of the mod. It was a fast-paced, hardcore tactical shooter, heavily influenced by games like CS and Battlefield. And once again, it wasn't a mainstream hit, but it was hugely successful for an indie shooter, selling over 5 million copies, which paved the way for a sequel, Insurgency Sandstorm, in 2018. Now, since 2007, there's obviously been quite a few big changes to the franchise, but the core format has remained the same. For example, there's a few key things every Insurgency game has in common, like they're all set in the Middle East, and they all still feature the same fast-paced, gritty, hardcore style gameplay. They've also all got a super fast time to kill. You're looking at around a 1 or a 2 bullet kill with just about any weapon in the game, including pistols. And they all also feature a stripped back HUD with no crosshair and no hit markers. And in vanilla servers, there's also no kill feed either. So in a nutshell, it's safe to say if you enjoy one of these games, you're probably going to enjoy them all, but that's assuming you can actually play them all. And to explain what I mean by this, we probably should start by talking about the 2007 Insurgency mod and why we're not going to be bothering to cover it in this video. The simple reason is that at this point it's only really peaking at less than about 40 daily active players, which is obviously barely enough to fill a decent server. Whereas Insurgency 2014 is still peaking at around 1,800 daily players and Sandstorm at about 3,500 players, which basically means you should be able to find at least one decent server close to where you are anywhere in the world. Now, getting back to the original question then, why have some people decided to make the switch to Sandstorm, and why have others decided to stick with 2014? And well, there's a lot to talk about in terms of gameplay, but just before we get into that, the most impactful reason that I've got to mention is, unfortunately, the most boring one. It's the cost. Insurgency 2014 is 6 years old at this point, so obviously it's going to run a lot better on older hardware. In other words, you're not going to need an expensive high-end PC. And not just that, but it's worth mentioning the game is just cheaper in general. It goes on sale almost all of the time for only a few bucks. And not just that, but it's even been released for free a few times over the years as well. The other big thing I should mention is that Insurgency 2014 is also available on OS X and Linux as well. So look, just say you're someone with a half-decent iMac or a MacBook Pro and you really want to play a hardcore FPS game like this, well, the good news is you can actually run 2014. On the other hand, though, Sandstorm is only currently available on Windows, and it's been confirmed by the devs recently that it won't be coming at all to Mac or Linux. However, and here's probably the most important point I need to make here, unlike the previous game, Sandstorm is actually going to be coming to console in the next few months. So obviously that's going to open the franchise up to a whole bunch of new players. Alright, so moving on, just say money isn't an issue and you've already got a decent Windows gaming PC. Which one of these games should you pick in that case? And, well, like I said, both games do follow a pretty similar format, but there's obviously a few key design differences that might swing you one way or the other. Most importantly, like I said, just like the original mod, Insurgency 2014 runs on the Source engine, which was a fairly old but reliable engine at the time, whereas Sandstorm runs on the much newer Unreal 4 engine, which, as you can see, is a lot more capable, but also has some issues when it comes to optimization. So what does that actually mean in-game? Well, it means Sandstorm looks and sounds a whole lot better, and it's also got a ton of other cool new features as well. But like I said before, it's pretty obvious by this point the dev team are having some issues optimizing the game, and so as a trade-off, it's not quite as smooth as it probably should be. On the other hand, though, Insurgency 2014 is buttery smooth, even on low-spec systems, which in a game like this really makes a massive difference. And look, for me personally, I don't really mind. I'd probably prefer the better textures of Sandstorm, but if you're someone who runs your games on low settings anyway to get a better frame rate, well, I can see why you'd go for 2014 instead. Now, with that being said, though, there's more to smoothness than just performance, and well, movement is a huge part of any FPS game, and that's something that's really changed a lot since 2014. And firstly, and this is a common thing with a lot of Source engine shooters, in Insurgency 2014, you'll notice when you're running around, you get caught on literally everything. And I'm talking from walls to doorways, trees, or even just a slope in the terrain. If you hit anything the game determines to be an object, your player will just stop dead. And not just that, but there's no vault mechanic in this game either. Instead, you have to crouch jump, which, as you can imagine, is super annoying when you get stuck on everything as it is. With that being said, though, I should mention that limited movement is actually an intentional gameplay feature in both of these games. Not to the extent that I mentioned before, but for example, both games have got a stance recoil modifier, and not just that, but the weight of your gear will actually slow you down. As you can imagine with the newer engine, this system is more complex in Sandstorm. For example, weight doesn't just affect your speed, but it also affects your recoil. And it's funny, I see people criticizing Sandstorm for being too clunky, but then I also see people criticizing it for not being slow and tactical enough. So once again, I guess it just comes down to what you prefer as a player. Now that there is a really good segue into the next point that I want to make, which is that probably the most widely debated difference between these two games is how Sandstorm has become more casual. And look, don't get me wrong, it's still way more hardcore than, say, for example, Call of Duty, but it's no secret the weapons are much harder to handle in the previous game. Only just recently, the devs tweaked the recoil again in Sandstorm to make it even easier, and in an official dev post, they were actually pretty honest about why. In a nutshell, as the game gets bigger, it's reaching a wider audience of more casual players, and basically the devs don't want the skill curve to be so steep that it scares those players off. The other thing you'll notice the devs have done in Sandstorm to rope in their casual players is to introduce more traditional FPS modes like TDM and Domination. Whereas previously the most popular modes available, like Push and Firefight, were a lot more focused on objectives and featured more punishing wave spawn systems. Now, those modes still exist in Sandstorm, but the main point to be made here is that in the previous game, the dev team would have never even thought twice about adding arcadey style modes. And that in itself is a huge indicator of how the franchise is evolving. It's not the 100% super serious hardcore shooter it once was, and once again, you might think that's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, so far we've focused on the really top level stuff, how the game looks, feels, and whether or not you can even play it at all. But what we haven't talked about yet is the content itself, and once again, even though both of these games have got a lot of similarities, there's definitely been a shift in the design focus. Like, for example, Insurgency 2014 clearly seems to have more of a CQB focus, and it seems to have a lot more urban-style maps, which isn't to say that it doesn't have larger, more open-style maps. They're just, for a start, not as large or open as in Sandstorm, and also, most importantly, they're just not as popular with the player base. So what does that mean in-game? Well, it means 2014 is a lot more like CSGO in the sense that good players can memorize maps and do stupid things like time RPG so they kill half the enemy team in their spawn. Whereas in Sandstorm, that doesn't really happen as much, and there's more gameplay options than just CQB as well. You can flank around the sides, or you can choose to play the long game up the back of the map if you really want to. Also, I should mention, to support the more open range map design, Sandstorm has got light vehicles that can be controlled by players, and also AI vehicles that can be called in by a commander role. And speaking of the commander role, well, they can actually call in other things as well, like gas and artillery strikes, which obviously would be an absolute nightmare on the super tight close quarters maps of Insurgency 2014. Now, that brings me to the next point, which is that, as well as the scale, the other big difference Sandstorm has up its sleeve is that the maps are just more detailed. Whereas, on the other hand, Insurgency 2014's maps are very Spartan, which, I mean, might be a positive thing if you're a comp player, but for the average Joe, it just means there's not as much cover. Not just that, but 2014's building interiors are a lot less detailed as well, and they lack basic stuff like glass windows and doors, which makes breaching so much more fun in Sandstorm. And lastly, another point I've got to mention is that a lot of the modes in Sandstorm actually have presets geared for each of the factions, which means that you get to experience those maps from two different perspectives. One thing I will say about 2014, though, is that when it comes to the sheer amount of content, well, Sandstorm can't really compete just yet. And the main reason I say that is because, well, Sandstorm doesn't have modding support yet, meaning literally all we have to play right now is just the vanilla stuff. And that brings me to another important point, which is that new content is actually a problem that Sandstorm has had this year. In fact, the dev team actually had to abandon their 2019 roadmap. So maybe that's another reason that people are going back to the old game. If the new one isn't giving players anything new, but the old one still is, then it just makes sense, right? But anyway, I'm slowly starting to figure out that we could sit here and talk about these games all day. So to finish up, I just want to make a few points on loadouts and customization. And once again, for the most part, both of these games are pretty similar. They both have faction-locked gear, class systems, and supply-based loadouts. They also allow you to customize not only your weapons, but also attachments, explosives, armor, and other gadgets. And like I said before, when you're creating a loadout, not only do you need to stay within the supply cap, but you also have to think about weight and how that's going to affect your movement and handling in-game. Now, the big difference between these games, though, is that Insurgency 2014 firstly has less options to begin with, and it also doesn't have any kind of progression system. Whereas Sandstorm, on the other hand, has introduced XP and a level system with an in-game currency, which you can use to buy vanity items to customize the way your character looks in-game. Now, with that being said, though, there's no weapon skins, and just like in the previous game, weapon attachments and armor change your visual appearance as you select them with your loadout. So all in all, the only difference here is stuff that you can't actually see yourself in-game. So I guess it really comes down to whether or not you care about how other players see you. But anyway, guys, like I said, I know there's a ton of other things we can probably talk about, but we've got to end this video somewhere. So all in all, to finish up, look, like I said, if you're a fan of either one of these games, then honestly, I think you'd be happy with both. Now, I know that's not probably the answer you guys want from a video like this, so if I really had to pick one or the other, I'd probably say the safer buy at this point is definitely Sandstorm. Which isn't to say that you shouldn't buy Insurgency 2014, it's honestly a classic, it's just that it's kind of on the cusp of starting to feel pretty outdated. Now, also, I should mention Sandstorm has come a long way in the last year or so. It's running a lot better now than it ever has before, and the dev team are getting back on track with new content. And not just that, but in the last few weeks, they opened up the upcoming level editor for a select group of beta testers. So that means that custom content is coming soon as well. But even so, even if Sandstorm was hands down the best shooter ever made, and it was in every way better than Insurgency 2014, there's still something nostalgic about the older game that keeps people coming back for more. And so look, I wouldn't be surprised if fast forward another 6 years, if YouTube is still here, that we're still making videos just like this one. And for good reason. It's just that good. But anyway, guys, that just about wraps up this quick comparison video. So as always, make sure you let me know what you think in the comment section down below. And just remember that I can't possibly cover every little last detail in just one video, even if this is a pretty long one. So if you think I've missed anything, please leave it down below so everyone else can check it out. As always, though, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and please feel free to check out the links in the description if you want to see any more of these videos. And also, don't forget you can find my Twitter and Discord links down there as well if you want to keep in touch. And as always, until next time, see you later, and have a good one.